You're itching for your next adventure, but you're stuck on one big question. Where should we go and when? National parks are incredible year-round, but picking the right one for the season can make or break your trip. Imagine hiking without the crowds, spotting wildlife at its peak, or avoiding scorching heat in the desert. In this episode, I'm giving you the ultimate month-by-month guide to the best national parks to visit, plus how to combine some parks for an unforgettable trip. Let's get planning. If you want to start traveling more with your family, this podcast is for you. Welcome to Wanderwise, a family travel podcast. I'm Megan Whitley Medlin, a mama of 4 with a serious case of wanderlust. Traveling with kids presents many challenges, but with the right tools in your toolbox, you can create unforgettable memories. Whether you enjoy exploring U.S. national parks or international destinations, this podcast is your ultimate resource to inspire your travels and help you craft well-thought-out itineraries for your family's next big adventure. Get ready to plan smarter and wander wisely. Your next adventure starts now. Hey there, fellow adventurers. Welcome back to Wanderwise, Family Travel Made Simple. I'm your host, Megan Whitley Medlin, and today we're tackling one of the biggest questions I get asked all the time. What's the best national park to visit in XYZ month? I get it all the time. Recommendations for what's the best place to see in April? What time of year is the best time to see this park? Well, today you're in luck because I've put together the ultimate guide to help you plan a trip to the national park no matter what time of year it is. And since we all love efficiency, I'll also highlight which parks make sense to visit together in one trip. Some parks are close enough to each other that you can combine them into one epic adventure. Others are best visited as a standalone trip based on their location and seasonal accessibility. So, let's get started. Before we break things down by month, I want to talk about why timing is so important when you're planning a national park trip. So you have a few things to consider because a lot of your activities are going to be outside. You want to consider the weather. Some parks are completely inaccessible in the winter due to snow. I'm looking at you, Glacier. I'm looking at you, North Cascades. There you can go, but as a family, it's unlikely that your big trip to Sea Glacier National Park should be taken in the wintertime. You're just going to miss so much. Granted, it's gorgeous when it's snowing, but I want you guys to be able to get the fullest experience in the park. And on the flip side of that, considering weather, some are so brutally hot in the summer. Hello, Death Valley. Looking at you. That you do not want, it's unsafe. It's not a great idea to tack that on to your summer vacation plans. They can get upwards of like 100 teens in the summer, and that's not safe or fun for anyone. Another factor to consider are the crowds, and I love that everyone is going out and enjoying these parks and it's gaining popularity. I know there was a very big spike in national park travel in that year that we will not mention or name, but starts with a C and ends with an Ovid. Lots of people started going to national parks during those years. Some parks are best visited in shoulder seasons to avoid those peak crowds, especially like you've got the most visited parks like Zion. If you try to visit those over, major holidays like Easter or in the summertime, it's just going to be so crowded. So those may be better in the fall or the winter. Same could be said for Great Smoky Mountains. A lot of people want to go there and see the fall foliage, and how I do encourage you to see that at some point. It is going to be extremely crowded, so maybe opt to visit that park in the spring instead. So if avoiding crowds is a goal of yours, you want to really look at those shoulder seasons, and those vary for different parks. The third thing to consider in timing with traveling to national parks, you want to be mindful of wildfire season. You want to be mindful of seasonal closures in places like Oregon and California. Late summer and early fall can bring wildfire risks and can kind of upturn your travel plans a little bit. I'll talk about that more in depth as we move on. But that has definitely affected some of my family's vacations in having to avoid a national park because of wildfire closures. Spring runoff after the snow is melting can make some trails dangerous in mountainous parks. So you want to be really aware of those weather events, those natural events that can affect your planning and affect your trip. And then, of course, you're going to have some parks that have reserved entry, your timed entry. And for those parks, you have to have reservations to even enter the park because they're trying to reduce the footprint on that park's system. Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's break it down month by month and talk about where to go and how to make the most of your trip. National parks to visit by month. I'm just going to start with January and work our way all the way down to December. And this is not an end-all be-all list. There are certainly ones that can overlap when it comes to a great time to visit these parks. And I'll try to remember all of the ones that I would recommend in that month. Starting off with January, I love to recommend the Everglades, Biscayne, and Dry Tortugas. Those are your 3 Florida parks, and January really provides perfect time to go visit those 3 parks. They're relatively close together. Dry Tortugas is going to be the one that is further out there and harder to get to, but they could be put into one big cluster of a trip if you have that time. The weather is perfect that time of year. It's not too hot. You're going to have lots of wildlife viewing. Think manatees and alligators. And there's several spots. Specifically, I'm thinking of Robbie's down in Key Largo. So if you decide to stay in Key Largo as kind of a central base area, which is what we did, you can go to Robbie's and feed the tarpons, and there's pelicans all over the place. It's a really great time, and if you're afraid of pelicans, you should definitely not go because they will come up to you and try to take your fish. These 3 parks make a really great South Florida adventure. I would recommend flying into either Fort Lauderdale or Miami and renting a car. And like I said, you can stay in Southern Florida, but you're going to have quite a drive to Key West. It's a 2.5-hour drive from Key Largo to Key West. And depending on whether you're taking the sea ferry or the seaplane down to Dry Tortugas, you're going to have a really long day. We chose to do the sea ferry because there's 6 of us and a seaplane was going to be a pretty penny. So we got up at like 3 a.m. and drove to Key West. And from Key West, we had to check into the boat around 6:45, I think. And it was a 2.5-hour ferry ride over down towards Dry Tortugas. This is a fantastic day. I will say you need to reserve those ferry tickets or the seaplane arrangements before anything else. That is kind of what will dictate your entire itinerary, is availability for getting that ferry ticket to Dry Tortugas. That's your only way there. And so if you make this whole trip and your goal is to see all 3 national parks in Florida, but you wait until, I don't know, a month or 2 before your departure to purchase your tickets for the ferry, you're going to be sorely disappointed because it's very likely that those will be sold out on the dates that you're wanting to go. My recommendation for those 3 parks are going to be figure out your time frame, the dates you are arriving and the dates you are leaving, and then decide based on availability what day you'll be going to Dry Tortugas. Then you can build out the rest of your trip from there. Biscayne has wonderful boat tours that you can go on. Most of that park is underwater, so I do encourage you to get out on a boat and snorkel, check out the mangroves and all of the marine life. And then Everglades, there are several areas that are not going to require your very advanced planning. The Shark Valley tram would be one of the only things I would think that would need extra planning time, or an airboat ride. But there's lots of companies that offer that. So those are the three main things for that national park trip, or the three parks you can visit in Florida. And I really think January is a fabulous time of year to make that trip. Okay, February, the month of love. For February, I have chosen Death Valley in California due to the climate of that area. It's a really great time of year. I would also recommend February, March, April. Those are all great months to visit Death Valley. You can fly into Vegas, spend some time there, see a show, go into Death Valley. There's also, not too far from Vegas, is a state park called Valley of Fire State Park, which is really awesome, kind of an alternative to the very famous wave that you have to have a permit for to hike. There are some really similar hikes at that state park that you do not have to have a permit for. But again, you want to go in those cooler months. Depending on how much time you have, Death Valley can make a really great long weekend trip, especially if you pair it with some of the excitement of Las Vegas, if that is your scene. But I would also recommend Southern Arizona for this time of year. Saguaro, Petrified Forest are all going to be really great options for February. You could even tuck into Sedona. It may have a little bit of snow that time of year, but it's going to be much cooler than if you were to go later in the spring or summer. Death Valley, you could definitely spend 1 to 2 days exploring. There are lots of different hiking options in different sections of the park. Saguaro is really going to be one of those parks, in my opinion, that you can spend a half a day and pretty much get a feel for the very large cacti and the other flora and fauna in that park. I'm sure if you wanted to spend more time there, you could certainly do that. But for our family, that half a day was really just enough time. And we did also squeeze in the Petrified Forest, which I think is another half a day park. The desert wildflowers typically bloom around that February, March timeframe too, so that can be really unique to see if you decide to travel that time of year. Those parks are kind of remote, so a long weekend, great option. If you have an extended amount of time, I may suggest moving that cluster of parks, say including Grand Canyon. I would probably suggest doing that maybe shoulder seasons, more like April or October. Grand Canyon can get some unique weather too, so it's not quite as dry. It's up at a higher elevation than Death Valley. Moving into March, my best recommendation for March is going to be heading south, but south central. And I would include Guadalupe Mountain and Carlsbad Caverns, and then making the long 5-hour trek down, maybe 6 hours, to Big Bend National Park. That is in the very southern part of Texas, an absolutely gorgeous, very remote park that is quite worthy of several days worth of exploring. My family flew into El Paso, and we did this over a March spring break. I believe we had about 5 days, so we really hit the ground running. Carlsbad Caverns was closed at the time because it was 2021, but I would have liked to have included that in our trip had we had that option. So definitely try to loop that one in if you are planning to spend a week on this itinerary. I think 7 days would be 6 or 7 days would be a really nice time frame for this, just because there is quite a bit of driving from Guadalupe Mountain down to Big Bend. Guadalupe Mountain, a great half day. You could spend more time. There's some really nice trails there. It's mountainous and really cool. We did the Devil's something. I'm trying to think of that trail name. It'll come back to me. And then we rented a car. Of course, we had the car the whole time. We took the car down to Big Bend. Long, flat highways and just getting to like floor it. It was really exciting for the kids. And we spent 3 days just trail after trail in Big Bend. It was absolutely stunning. And we kayaked on the Rio Grande, which was also a unique experience. And then we hopped over to Big Bend State Park for about half a day and spent some time there before driving back to El Paso. March is a great time of year to visit Big Bend. It's another one of those hot summer destinations, so it does have a limited amount of time that you would be able to go see it, but extremely worth it. The kids are going to love it. It was really special. It ranks in my top 5 for sure. And I think because it's so remote, not everyone has had that experience. And that speaks to the crowds too. It was not crowded in March. There were not a lot of people on the trails because it's so remote. You're really going to be secluded. So whether you like that or not, good to know and keep that in mind. For the month of April, I am going to recommend the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and that is on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. Such a beautiful park, and that's going to put you in prime wildflower blooming season. And I'm going to include Shenandoah in this list too, not necessarily for you to take in the same trip because there's quite a distance between those two parks, but in my opinion, very similar because you've got, those eastern mountains that are more large rolling hills than the tall peaks. So they are similar in my opinion. You're going to have really nice weather. Spring in the south is so nice because you're having, 60s to low 70s in the daytime, and then you're getting down into probably the 40s in the evening. And so a light jacket and a campfire still feel really nice. And then all the way on the other side of the country, I'm going to recommend Yosemite in April/May. The snowmelt starts to rise, and that does wonders for the waterfalls. So as you visit Yosemite throughout the year, as the summer goes on, by the time August, September roll around, some of the waterfalls are going to be dried up or just barely a trickle. And it was important to me to see these towering granite cliffs and the water just pouring over them. I wanted to see all the waterfalls. So we actually went in April, and I love that for that park. It is a good busy time of the year, so it's one of the most visited parks. You're going to expect to see crowds pretty typically throughout that busiest season from waterfalls on. I would say wintertime would be the only slower time in Yosemite, but even then, it's just one of those top visited parks. So great time to visit for the waterfalls in April/May. Moving into May, I would also add to this list your Central Arizona parks, Grand Canyon. You could even loop in and go to Zion in Utah and Bryce, maybe Capitol Reef. Those are all great options for an extensive road trip if you have that time, maybe when school lets out mid-May or end of May and you want to take a longer road trip. I would definitely try to include as many of those stops as you can, even swinging over to Page and seeing Antelope Canyon, Horseshoe Bend, Monument Valley, all those areas, Lake Powell, would be great for a longer trip. If you only have a long weekend or 5 days, sticking to the Grand Canyon, Route 66 would be a fabulous option in May. And I'm going to go ahead and include Moab with Arches National Park, just if you wanted to do your Utah Mighty 5. I know that's on lots of people's bucket list, as it should be. Fabulous parks. Moab is home to Arches National Park. This is an outdoor lover's paradise. There is no shortage of activities to do, and your kids will absolutely love it if they love climbing and running around. It's like a big sandbox, and it's amazing. And you can also pair that up with Canyonlands, maybe drive to Capitol Reef. Goblin Valley State Park is nearby, and I would highly recommend you make that pit stop if you are able and have time. Utah has so much to offer, and for our family, we broke that up into 2 trips, and I still feel like we could go back and see entirely different things. So don't feel like you have to cram all that into one trip and do a disservice to each of those parks. But certainly if that's your one time you're going to see it and you want to go hard on seeing all 5 of them, it's doable. There's just a plethora of things to do, and that's a great time of year. I would also add that November, with the exception of maybe Bryce Canyon, they're up about 8,000 feet. So sometimes they're already in snow in November, but I would also recommend that Utah cluster in November as well. Lots of just better weather altogether in that time of year. For June, I'm going to recommend Acadia in Maine. That is in Bar Harbor. A very unique park, and by June, the park is so green and the temperatures are still kind of cool, but especially if you go kind of early June, you're going to head off some of the main summer crowd that comes in. And 3 to 4 days in this park, you can ride bicycles on old carriage roads, you can get out on the water, there's lots of hiking, and I love that park because a lot of their trails are networked, and so you can start on one trail and work your way over to another trail and loop back around. There's so many hiking opportunities in that park, and June is a really great time to visit Acadia. Coming down a little bit more south, our newest national park, New River Gorge. June's a great time to see this park. You can get on the trail, you can whitewater raft. There are rock climbing opportunities. A lot of similarities truly between Acadia and New River Gorge, and great choice for June. They are going to be your standalone parks. There's not too many things surrounding them, so you'll be able to give each park the time that it deserves. One amazing highlight and something very unique to the New River Gorge is a tall bridge that passes from one side of the gorge to the next, and you can actually go on a tour to where you walk on the catwalk just under that bridge. So that's putting you like 800 feet above the gorge, and they take you across, I think it's just a little less than a mile, and the guide is telling you about the bridge history, and you can feel the traffic rumbling over your head. And it's a pretty amazing experience, not for the faint of heart. I would say if you have any fear of heights at all, this would not be the excursion for you, but it is available to kids of a certain age. I want to say 8 years old and up, but you might have to fact check me on that one. A beautiful park to visit in June. July and August, these are going to be pretty interchangeable. Some of the northern parks, like Rocky Mountain, North Cascades, Rainier, Glacier, Crater Lake, those are going to be your higher elevation parks, and you really want to aim to see those as late in the summer season as you can get, because sometimes the road, your main scenic road that goes through the park, will be closed until late June, early July. I know when I visited Glacier the first time back in 2020, the road to the Going to the Sun Road had just opened, and we were there July 23rd, and it had opened the week before. So had we visited 2 weeks before that, we wouldn't have been able to access the entire park like we wanted to. So keep that in mind. Later in July, early August, mid-August, late August, all those are great options for these parks. So I am going to cluster these together, these 2 months, because there's so many similarities. Crater Lake is another one where the road is not going to be open That long scenic loop highway is not going to be open if you visit in June. Very unlikely. To make the most of those high elevation parks, you do want to plan to go as late in the summer season as possible. And on the flip side of that, starting, mid-September, mid-October, Mother Nature doesn't tell us, but those are going to be times where snow starts to come down and you're going to start to see closures, even temporarily closures, before the big snow settles in. So just keep that in mind. Now, a park that you don't have to be too worried about snow is Olympic National Park, and that is in Washington State. Olympic National Park is very spread out, and for that park, we spent several days, and we hopped around to different locations. Just because it is so spread out, we didn't want to spend all of our time driving. We wanted to be able to access Hurricane Ridge easily, and so we stayed in Port Angeles for a couple of days, and then we went to Forks and stayed in Forks for a couple of days to visit the rainforest and the coast. So keep that in mind, but that park is great many, many, many months out of the year. Love Olympic National Park. So as for these 2 months, July and August, there's several different clusters of parks you could put together. Of course, all of the Washington state parks. You could cluster several of the Colorado state parks. Glacier is great on its own. It's long enough or big enough that you could spend an entire trip there, or you can combine it with a longer stay and drive down to Yellowstone and Grand Tetons. The Grand Tetons is another one of those parks that is great later on in the summer, but is going to be really nice throughout the fall too. I would save that for your September time frame. I'm going to include Lassen Volcano in this summertime park. I was surprised as I was doing research on that park that they do get a lot of snow. They're also extremely prone to wildfires, which is for our last summer, our trip to Oregon. We flew into Nevada, and the plan was to drive from Reno up to Lassen Volcano and spend a day and a half there and then drive on into Oregon. But there were lots of very bad wildfires last August. So we were unable to go in the park. The park was closed to any visitors. Only workers were allowed to go in and out, and it was a dire situation. So they were evacuating homes and things around the area. So we did not get to visit Lassen, but I would highly recommend if you are looping in Crater Lake and want a couple extra days to dip down and see Lassen Volcano. September is such a magical month. Everybody gets excited for the change of the seasons. I mentioned Yellowstone and Grand Tetons. I think this would be a great time of year to spend in Yellowstone. There's so much to see. It's not quite snowy yet, but the temperatures have gone down some. The summer crowds have gone down, and you're not going to be as crowded on those really popular sites like Old Faithful and Hayden Valley. You're going to have more, I'm not going to say no crowd, but I'm going to say less crowded areas. And you're going to find better rates once that Labor Day holiday is over too. I would recommend combining Yellowstone and Grand Tetons. Those are about an hour and a half apart from the south gate of Yellowstone to the north gate of Grand Tetons. I would stay in a couple different areas. I wouldn't try to drive back and forth if you have the time to do that. But that's a great combination trip that would not be too much crazy driving in between the areas, the two parks. My next recommendation for September is going to be your Dakotas. And the three parks that are in the Dakotas, you have Badlands National Park in South Dakota, and then you have Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, and that has 2 units. I do recommend making that extra jaunt up to the north unit. It is a little bit of a drive, but if you have the time, it is so gorgeous, and there's no one there. It is not crowded at all, and there's wild horses and buffalo. It was just magical. And then the last park in that cluster would be Wind Cave. And Wind Cave has, obviously, caves and caverns, but there are some above-ground hiking options as well. Not only those two states full of national parks, but South Dakota just blew us away with the beauty. Don't miss Custer State Park. There's incredible hiking, and the Needles Highway is so cool to drive around those windy roads with the spires of rock coming up out of the ground. And then, of course, you're right there at Mount Rushmore and can throw in a little history for the kids and get to see that national monument while you're there. Such a fabulous trip. Perfect for kids. Wildlife, no crowds, beautiful weather. There's going to be a little bit of overlap here in October because it is the fall foliage season, and there is really, in my opinion, as a North Carolinian, no better place to see the fall foliage than the Great Smoky Mountains, Shenandoah, and New River Gorge. And because of the different elevations, they are all changing at a little bit of different times in the season, some late in September, some early to mid, all the way to the end of October. And if you haven't seen the fall color change, I highly recommend to pack up the family and make your way to one of those parks. Acadia is another one that is going to be really lovely that time of year. And then I'm going to throw in Rocky Mountain and a couple of the Colorado parks, those yellow aspen trees. So beautiful to see in the fall. It will be crowded just because that does attract lots of visitors, but if you can get past the crowds, you're going to have great weather and get to see some amazing colors. For November, I would like to recommend Joshua Tree National Park. It's maybe one that flies under the radar a little bit. I'm sure you could spend more time there than a half a day, but a half a day to a day in Joshua Tree, and you are with your family. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably traveling with your family. So why not go to Anaheim and spend a couple days at Disneyland? And if you wanted to extend that trip out, you could head over to the coast of California and visit Channel Islands National Park. It's going to be windy, and you have to reserve a ferry to get out to that park, but that's a really great combination for a week, or maybe over Thanksgiving if you wanted to just do the national parks and not Disneyland. That would be a good combo for that too. December, again, you could probably do those Florida national parks if you wanted to spend some time over Christmas. But my biggest pick for you in December is going to be the Hawaii Volcanoes National Park and Haleakala in Maui. So those are on two different islands, obviously. Hawaii Volcanoes National Park is on the Big Island, and the Big Island is very big. So make sure you're staying on the right side of the island to visit that park, or you'll be doing quite a bit of driving. You can take a quick plane ride inter island air to Maui and see Haleakala too. Take the tour that brings you up before sunrise. You can watch the sunrise come up over the volcano. It's absolutely stunning. It's freezing cold. It's like just above freezing when we went. And then you can choose to bicycle down or take the van back down to town and start your day that way. So those are great options for your longer breaks with your kids over Christmas. Okay, that was a lot. I hope this breakdown helps you start thinking about which national park you want to visit next. There's no wrong way to do it, but it is important that you keep in mind the weather and the crowds and just those seasonal closures and wildfires before you start planning a big trip to help you narrow down where you should go. Before we wrap up, here are some quick tips to keep in mind when planning your national park adventures. It's important to book early. Lodging, especially inside national parks, fills up fast, typically even a year in advance. Glacier, Yosemite, etc. Those are all going to fill up within the park very, very quickly. Don't forget those shoulder seasons. Spring and fall often have the best weather and fewer crowds, depending on what park you're visiting. Check the park conditions. Look for road closures, wildfire warnings, or other weather updates before you go. And then have a plan B. Nature is unpredictable. There's no rule book, so have a backup or activity planned in case something is closed. Okay, friends, that's a wrap on today's episode of Wanderwise, Family Travel Made Simple. I hope this guide helps you start planning your next national park adventure. I know it was a lot of information, but I could talk about national parks all day. I'd love to hear from you. Message me or reply to this podcast. Which national park is at the top of your list this year? Come visit me in my Facebook group. Until next time, wander wisely. Thanks for joining another episode of Wanderwise. I hope you're feeling inspired to plan your family's next unforgettable adventure. Join the community in my private travel Facebook group, linked in the show notes, for more travel tips and ideas. If you'd like a customized plan for your next vacation, fill out the form in the show notes to get started. Until next time, wander wisely.